I'm Scott Allen Miller. It's the 6th of December, 2023. This is my vlog of daily life living in Leon, Nicaragua. Today I want to talk about some of the risks that there are with buying a house early. And I don't mean the kind of risks we talked about in other episodes. I mean, I'm going to talk about some of the financial analysis that needs to go into the decision making around having a house that you don't live in, especially when it's a house here in Nicaragua, because it's easy to look at it through one set of lenses. And there's some more information that may be pretty useful for people when you're doing calculations about exactly when you want to pull the trigger on buying versus renting, visiting, staying in a hotel, or whatever. So we're going to dig into all that along with a few other topics right after our bump. Alright, some quick news. By the time that this is uploading, you should be, I believe, on the day you see this is actually the day that Venezuela and Guyana are meeting to discuss the territorial dispute of the Essequibo. This is going to be a little bit interesting as there's already a very heated situation going on. As you can imagine, this is 125 years. We dug into this a few days ago, but this is a little bit of an update. And of course, the people that have posted about this have generally posted exactly what we kind of alluded to from Guyana, which is we took it by force. It doesn't matter that we didn't abide by the arbitration. Come and get it if you want. Force of arms rules. And as often the case, the attitude, and it's very anecdotal, but the attitude leans towards whoever is the first aggressor should just be allowed to keep things. Basically, bully tactics work, which is what we see as an argument in wars throughout the world. Well, I know we invaded, but they shouldn't defend themselves. I know we took their territory, but we shouldn't defend themselves. Russia uses exactly this argument against the United States with Ukraine. Yes, Russia invaded, but Ukraine shouldn't fight back. It's their fault that they're fighting back, and now the U.S. is trying to turn that and use the same tactic against Venezuela and say, no, you can't fight back to defend that what was taken from you. So we're seeing the same argument being used in both cases, but from opposite sides. So it is a common psychological tool for making an argument when people are unaware of the situation and not paying any attention. For casual observers, it always feels like, oh, armed resistance feels wrong. But in this case, it's much like the example we use if Germany was invading Czechoslovakia. Yes, a lot of people are like, hey, let them invade, we'll figure this out in the courts. That's not how it works. Once you've been invaded, it's been lost, and you gotta stand up for your stuff. You're stuck. The world does not enforce equitable laws. We may have these international courts of justice, but they have no teeth. And of course, if they simply rule against one party, that party can just ignore it. That's the problem. And those words were used by one person from Guyana is exactly to what are you going to do about it, right? And of course, it's Guyana now that action is being taken. It's like, why can't we take this to the courts? But of course, it did go to the courts, and they didn't abide by an equitable outcome, right? When there was the 1899 arbitration, they paid off the arbitrator to invalidate the decision and to rule in their favor when it was not how the ruling was actually going to go. So we've already established that the rule of law will not be abided by in this situation. And so it sounds good. Well, why can't we go to court now that they're reacting? But they've already gone to court, right? It's much like why don't we let the voters decide long after the election's already happened, right? But the voters did decide. You don't want to abide by it. So we use that term, and people who aren't thinking it through go, yeah, let the voters decide. No, you already voted, and you're trying to ignore the vote. In this case, there's already been arbitration, and you're trying to ignore that it already has been arbitrated and wasn't going to go in Guyana's favor. That's the problem. There's no option that makes any sense except open conflict. And so it is what it is, but we can't look at one country or the other at this point as being the aggressor. This is simply an armed conflict over a disputed territory. Sometimes it has to happen. That's unfortunate. It's ridiculous in the modern world, but there isn't a good mechanism around it. And sometimes the world really does come down to who is stronger and who can take things for themselves. And there's nothing else to really give you any reasonable decision between places. Anyway, so that is going on, and today is supposedly the meeting. But the president of Guyana said straight up they weren't going to actually discuss the thing that was up for discussion, and said it was off the table, totally implying that they were never going to abide by, and they didn't in the past, so this is what the tradition is, right? That they're not going to abide by any international rulings anyway, so they're the only, basically they're saying we're going to, and both sides have already had some amount of open warfare, but since Guyana is the one extracting oil, they're in the position of, saying, well, you've got to fire the first shot. We're already taking the goods out of it, so too bad for you, right? So it leaves Venezuela with really no option except a military intervention to protect their interest, or to even have a seat at the table to discuss their interest. So that is today. Keep an eye on that. It is a important topic going on here in Latin America. So today's real topic. So I was having a discussion with someone, and they were saying about they want to buy a house. Everyone always does, right? Want to buy a house here in Nicaragua, and they want to buy it before they move. They said, it's not like someone who's going to be here part-time. Sure, they're going to be here part-time while they're looking, but eventually they're going to be here full-time, and they want to own a house. And one of his reasons for this, and this makes a lot of sense, this is some great logic, it's important to consider these things, but people always overstate this, so let's be very careful with it. He said, when I could buy a $30,000 to $40,000 house, which is on the low side, but certainly doable here in Nicaragua, I want to make that investment and have that paying rent up until I'm ready to move doesn't make any sense, because I'll be paying $300 to $400 a month, and that adds up really quickly. If you did $400 a month, that's pushing $5,000 a year, and that's a huge chunk of that purchase of a house. That's a lot to throw away, and he's absolutely right. However, the numbers are off and misleading, so let's dig into this a little bit, because it's a big deal. So if you're looking at, let's just say, a $30,000 house, if you're looking at that, which is very doable, we're going to use 30,000 because it's an even number, but typically you're looking more at like 32,000. Tends to be a really good sweet spot. 28,000 is doable for a lot of Americans. Canadians are looking at moving down, but we're in that ballpark, right? We're going to use 30,000 as just an easy number to work with. It sounds very affordable. That's great. But if you're going to rent, even at $300 a month, that's going to add up very quickly. That's $3,600 a year in rent. That's more than 10% the cost of the house. In order to have that happen, though, we have to realize that $300 would be a much larger, much more expensive house than what you're buying for $30,000. So those are not comparable. If you were going to rent something, typically you rent something smaller and less desirable than the one you're going to buy. Not always, but generally. So that's the first thing. But let's assume you wanted to rent the same house or equal. That house would probably rent much closer to $200 a month, maybe $250, but certainly not $300. Never $300. That would be outrageously high. At that price, at between $200 and $250, sure, it's still a big chunk of change compared to owning the house, but at that price, all of your expenses are being paid. Maybe not your power, maybe not your internet, but your maintenance on that house, the paint, the just fixing things. Those things are being paid for, and if you own a house, they are not. If you've ever been a landlord, you are aware that the cost of maintenance and wear and tear on a housing unit is significant. It's a big portion, along with taxes, although taxes are lower here, but taxes are still a factor in the cost of a house that you are renting. So it's important to remember that even if you're paying $250 a month to rent a place, quite a chunk of that is going into repairs and things. Maybe not every month, but over the course of a year or two, you're going to have a big percentage of that be used in those maintenance items. Now, if you're renting a place that you plan to buy someday, you're going to treat it better, it's going to last longer. If you're renting a place and you're really rough on it, it's going to go through a lot more. I know someone who rented here, a situation where someone rented out a house, they got 1 month's rent for $200, and over $3,000 of damage was done to the house in that 1 month. I believe a security deposit was also lost, so maybe they got $400, but it's no offset for the $3,000, and you can imagine how long they'd have to rent a house to recoup the lost $3,000 or the lost $2,600. And of course, we're talking about the recouping the loss. At no point are they making money on this rental. Now, that's an extreme example. It's the most extreme I have ever known, but it's happened here in Nicaragua, and it can happen. When you're renting houses at these incredibly low prices, people do have to be worried about that. Now, of course, you're not going to do that to your own house. That doesn't make any sense. But there is wear and tear, and it can be much larger than people realize. That's important to remember, that all that's being included. Also included is that you don't need to rent year-round. There may be situations why you do, but in general, you don't. You only rent when you need it. And maybe you have to rent a little bit extra, but not year-round. So if you're going to be coming down here for, say, 3 to 6 months at a time, you're going to spend a bunch of time, you can rent a place for 6 months. Now, if you're only going to be here for 5, you're going to overpay for that 6, and that seems like that's crazy. I don't want to pay for a month of rental that I'm not living in it. But if you're going to buy a house and not live in it, you're doing roughly the same thing. Maybe not as dramatically, but you're still doing the same thing, and you're doing it year round with no flexibility. If you rent, you can say, well, I'm coming down for this 3 to 6 months. I'm going to rent for 6 months. I'm going to come down this other time, but just for a week. I'm just going to stay in a hotel. I'm coming down. Oh, you know what? This year I got really busy. I'm not coming down at all. I'm going to wait a year and rent again. And you can take big times off. You get flexibility, right? So renting protects against the unknown. When you buy, you're making a commitment not only to what you want to do, but what you are going to do from a financial situation. You are saying, I have to actively use this the majority of the year in order to offset the cost versus rental. Whereas with renting, you have flexibility to say, well, if I accidentally want to use it too much, I'll overpay a little, but if I use it very little, I'll save a ton. It protects you in really good ways. When it ends up being the wrong decision, it's generally wrong very minorly, but when it's the right one, it often saves you quite a bit. So it's an important part of just general protection against the unknown. And sometimes people know exactly what's going to happen and can predict their future pretty accurately, but most of us cannot. It is not normal to have that kind of insight and be able to do that with great accuracy. And so we often get it wrong. We often put in big financial decision making, and of course, life throws all kinds of curveballs at us. Oh, I bought a 2-story house. I ended up having issues walking upstairs, and now I can't use it the way that I thought. I bought on the coast. I decided I wanted to live in the mountains. I, didn't have a respiratory problem when we bought the house, but now I do. I need to be in a dry climate or a cold climate or whatever. Things will change. Renting also protects against all those things. Maybe it's just you picked the wrong location. Now, of course, the person I talked to said, we're going to come down, we're going to spend tons of time, do it in person, take years to make the decision, make sure we know where we're going to be. And you can protect against a lot of those things. So for some of you, this stuff applies. For some of you, maybe not, but they're all factors to keep in mind. The big one, though, that I think gets overlooked is when you have a house here and you live in it, especially let's say a $30,000 house, that's typically going to be a maximum of 3 bedrooms. It's not going to be a huge place. It's relatively small. And it's not big enough for you to have live-in staff. I mean, you could find one that's big enough, but we're going to assume that's not what you're doing. You're going to have a reasonable house of 2 to 3 bedrooms. It is going to be for you. Maybe you'll have an office, maybe a guest room. It's meant for you to live in. And when you're living in it, you're just going to pay the mortgage, or you're going to have paid it out in cash, and you just have to deal with your maintenance items, and that's fine. Of course, you have to pay power and stuff. And if you buy that house ahead of time, so let's say you buy it this year and you're going to retire in 5 years. For 5 years, is your plan to be here half time? Okay, great. You're going to live in the house half time. But when you're not here, who's going to live in that house? And this is important because if you're in the United States or you're in Canada, generally you would very easily say, well, I'll just leave the house empty. Maybe I'll keep the internet on, have some cameras on it, but no big deal. Here in Nicaragua, well, technically you can do that. That would generally be advised against. That's something that none of us do. I don't know anyone who would do that. You are extremely likely to get squatters. While there isn't a big pressure for there to be more people out on the market shopping for houses, people live with their parents. They're not like, oh, I gotta go get a house. They're going to live at home. If you have an empty house and people know that it's empty, which does not take very much effort to figure out, and they know it's empty for long periods of time, there's every chance that they will move into the house. Someone will say, well, there's a house there and no one's going to catch me, and I could be living on my own. And what's the worst that happens? They get caught and they move back. Oh, I thought it was abandoned, and they move back in with their parents. That kind of stuff could happen. And that's not something you generally want happening to your house, especially as are they going to take care of it? Are they going to continue to do maintenance? No, they're going to wear the place out. They're not going to be investing in it, obviously. And there's the risk that they damage or take the things that you have in the house, which could include your appliances, right? If they move in and are there for long periods of time, they may be like, I bet they're coming back someday. Let's take this fridge out of here, right? Nicaragua is not known for violent crime. It is very low violent crime, but petty crime, where people are stealing things because you left them unattended, is relatively high. You're not going to get armed intruders, damaged, but you will get squatters. And that's just unfortunate, but there is crime in Nicaragua. It's just not generally violent, but you need to be prepared for it. So the assumption is that if you have a house you're going to leave empty for any amount of time, you're going to have what's known as a cuidador. That is a person who watches over it or takes care of it, was what the word actually means. And so generally that person is going to live there, and you're going to have to pay them a salary because they can't go anywhere. They have to be there all the time. I have land that I'm going to build a house on someday. I have had a person living there for years, right? I never go to the land. They live there, right? And they get paid a monthly salary. It is their job, and they can't do other things because they have to watch the property all the time. They have to make sure that people aren't dumping trash on it. They have to make sure people are not stealing things. They have to make sure that people are not squatting. They have to make sure that people are not doing damage or setting fires. Not that people would intentionally do damage, but they could easily creep on and be like, oh, here's a tree that I'd like to have for something, and take it. Oh, no one's using it. It's an empty property. Whatever. These are all things they have to protect against because it's a large property that easily people would mess with if there wasn't someone there actively all the time. So this is the assumption. Every person you know who has an empty property here in Nicaragua, maybe not in a high-end gated community where they have continuous security, maybe not in, certain enclaves, but in the vast majority of places, any standalone house, you're going to have a cuidador, either living in your main house or if you have a larger property in a secondary house, but able to go into your house and they'll do maintenance, right? It's more than just watching the house. They'll repair things. They'll report when something's broken, but you're still going to have to pay for those things to get fixed, and you have a person living there, and they're incurring electric costs, and you probably want to leave the internet on and all these things. So what is that going to cost you? So pretty typically in a house that you're not living in, cuidadors are often pretty cheap. $200 a month is reasonable. In some cases, you may be able to get a little bit below that, but probably not below $180. Generally, you are providing room. In some cases, you're providing board. And so with that, it sometimes makes sense for someone to work below minimum wage, especially if they have, for example, a spouse who has a normal job during the day. They're bringing in a reasonable income. The other spouse is like, well, then I'll just stay at home. I'll watch the kids. I'll hang out with the dogs. I'll do the laundry, whatever. And while doing that, I will keep an eye on this house, and every, hour or 5 hours or whatever, I'll take a walk around to just make sure that no one's doing anything. They're basically security. They're not like armed security. They're very casual security, but it's as if you were living there. You have a representative who's there all the time. This is really important. So you can get the cost down if they're living in your house and they're getting benefits from it, but there's going to be cost. And if you want them to have internet so they can communicate with you, so they can have cameras on and that kind of stuff, you have to figure in some of those costs. So let's figure that cheap internet is $30 a month, which you'll be, doing pretty well to get that, but it's doable. And let's say you get a cuidador even at a pretty hefty discount, you get one for $170 a month. That combined cost is $200 a month on top of any cost you've paid for that house. Well, $200 a month, you could rent a pretty decent place. It is completely doable to get a nice 2-bedroom for less than $200 per month on a 6-month lease. It's easy to see how it may seem like I don't want to throw away all this money on rent. I could put it towards purchasing a house and then own this house and have all that equity. That works in my favor. And that makes sense until you think about maintenance, security, and those types of factors. And really quickly, you can end up with these little bills. Well, I want to keep the internet on. Well, I'm going to keep the power on. And even though I'm not going to pay for the cuidador's power, they're only going to use a little bit. The house is going to use a little bit. I'm still going to have $5, $10, maybe $15 a month of that. Those little things add up really quickly. And so it doesn't take too much to end up in a situation where you can picture how a house that you own and are not living in at a given time may cost you more on a month when you're not there than an apartment will cost in a month when you are there. And of course, if you have a cuidador who's there whenever you're not there, and they have some little expenses that go with things, and then sometimes you are there, where are they going to live? If you have a large house and they live separately, it's normal for them to live there full time. So nearly everyone I know has a cuidador if they have a large house and they come and go. If they live there full time, most people do not. Some do, for sure, but not all do. But if you're coming and going, you're essentially always going to have a live-in cuidador who lives there on the property. And so when you're not there, yeah, they're doing one set of things. When you are there, they're still doing some of those things. They may keep a watch on the place at night. They act as additional security for you. They do a little bit of maintenance, whatever. They're still needing to get paid because it's not like they can come and go just because you've come back. So this ends up potentially with a very high cost because when you're living there, you're still paying them. as opposed to when you have an apartment. When you are there, it may be cheaper on a monthly basis, and when you're not there, it incurs no cost at all. Maybe you need a little bit of storage to keep your appliances in so you don't have to repurchase those every time that you go. That could make sense. So there may be some cost, and there's a bunch of these factors need to be considered. But this cost of a cuidador can be so significant that it really can make owning a property, especially a low-cost property that you're not going to live in, impractical. Now, of course, you could do something like sell it on Airbnb, sell it, by the weekend or whatever, and offset some of those costs if the cuidador doesn't have to move out all the time. If the cuidador has to move out all the time, so you can do that, you're going to incur a bunch of other costs because they need another place to live as well, and they won't be there. They could help take care of it and get it ready as an Airbnb, but that needs to offset quite a bit, right? So yes, there's ways that owning a house can be beneficial financially. Of course, emotionally, it could be worth a lot of money to you. So put a dollar figure on that. But if you're only talking about the financial situation, there's a bunch that needs to be considered. Yes, Airbnb could be profitable, but generally is only going to offset losses, and having someone to take care of it, clean it, manage it for an Airbnb, or just keep it safe for when you're not using it, will probably incur equal or more cost than having a rental would instead, especially if that rental is not better than the house itself. Now, if you're talking about $1 million property, these numbers become inconsequential, and of course you're going to spend that kind of money on security, on internet, and those things all the time, no big deal. But when we're talking about a low-cost house and you're trying to save money versus renting, chances are these things may be the most significant financial factors, and they're ones that people often overlook when they're talking about these numbers, right? How much am I going to pay for this? How much am I going to pay for that? Oh, wait, it's 100% more for this because of this entire type of expense I hadn't really planned on, because until you're here and thinking about it, it's not something that you do think about. And often these things happen kind of organically. Oh, we need internet for the cameras. Okay, that's $30 a month. But if you're me, I have $100 of internet per month because I need fiber. So even my apartment down the street, my restaurant down the street, each of them has a relatively expensive fiber connection because I need to make sure I have really good upload speeds, not just download speeds, and absolute rock solid stability everywhere I go. So I pay for that over and over again, and that really adds up fast. You would not have that happen, but you may easily say, no, I'm going to be working there remotely some of the time, so I really need a good stable internet connection with amazingly fast fiber upload speeds, so I'm going to pay more, not a ton, but more, and that's going to add into that cost. When you're not there, those extra costs become really exacerbated. When you're living there full time, those things are no-brainers. So I just wanted to point some of these things out when you're thinking about why you may want to purchase early, and maybe you do, for sure. There are definitely reasons to maybe do it. And if you find that perfect dream home and you get just the right price and you're able to buy it in cash, and it's going to be the one you're going to fall in love with, and you want mentally to keep being able to come back to it and establish a trend long before you actually make the final move. And when you finally make that move, oh, it's going to be so perfect because you have been connected to the place and part of the community, and they know that that's your house for so long. Maybe that's worth that extra money, and maybe you can find ways to offset that money, but certainly consider those costs before making that decision, because those could be enormous costs that you have not been considered in any way whatsoever. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe as always. You can support the channel, and I really appreciate it when you do, by buying me a coffee at the link buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. That comes directly to me and helps make all this possible, whether it's my research, my travels, my cameras, my computers to upload, my internet access to be able to upload these every day. Those things are really important. So thank you to everyone who makes this possible. And as always, please share on social media. Take a moment, watch an extra episode, hit a like on that too. All those things help a lot in getting the word out and getting the algorithm to promote us here on the show. And tell your friends and family, get someone to watch the show with you, and I will see all of you tomorrow.